This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll run through all the business news stories you need to know about from Africa and beyond. But first, to run through the markets here for you. With the exception of Kenya, most of the other bourses we do track here, well, excluding the American market for the time being, essentially ended the day pretty much in negative territory. Some interesting news coming out of South Africa, though. MultiChoice, the largest pay-TV firm on the continent, its shares closed the day over 8% higher as it reported its results for the year ending in March. Perhaps the most interesting bit of news from that was the announcement that it will offer access to Netflix and Amazon Prime Video on its next generation decoder, essentially becoming a sort of super aggregator for the nearly 20 million clients it serves at the moment right across Africa. Here's what's coming up tonight. A company in Ghana develops a cheap rapid testing kit for COVID-19. Month of lockdown pushes South Africa's business confidence levels to record lows.
It is still a problem, especially women who feel like there's no way they can be seen with kinky hair.
And we'll explore the politics and the business of natural hair care with the co-founder of a Kenyan hair care brand, Marini Naturals. All that and more in the pipeline for you tonight. But let us start the hour in Ghana, where a local firm over there, Incas Diagnostics, is expecting approval for its rapid COVID-19 antibody test kit. As the GTN's Noel Makuguna reports, these tests could help health authorities to plan around the easing of pandemic restrictions.
Ghana's Incas Diagnostics has developed a cheap, rapid testing kit for COVID-19. If approved by the Food and Drug Administration next month, it will complement a tracking app developed by the same company. The company says its kits could help health authorities ease pandemic restrictions.
The utility of the antibody test is in public health decision making, it's in looking at the extent of spread, it's in looking at who has been exposed, and it's looking at making an antibody map of the various communities, various countries, various cities, to be able to know when and how to ease restrictions to ease the various restrictions that have been put in place by the various governments in different countries.
With support from the World Health Organization, the company will partner with developers in Nigeria, Cameroon, South Africa and Senegal. Together, they will create a mobile app that will trace people potentially at high risk of getting the virus.
The app can also be used without a rapid test because basically it's able to give you the various components, whether somebody is high risk, somebody is medium risk or low risk. So when the person is low risk, the person can move around. Medium risk, the person you are closely monitoring the person.
Ghana has reported one of the highest numbers of COVID-19 cases in Africa, with more than 10,000 infections. The government has begun a first easing of restrictions to curb the spread of the virus and plans to reopen schools and universities from June 15th. Noel Makugu, CGTN.
On to South Africa now. Business confidence levels there have hit a record low in the second quarter of the year. That's according to the latest reading of the survey by the Rand Merchant Bank. This comes on the back of the coronavirus-led lockdown that stalled the economy, which was already reeling from a recession that it entered, the second in 2 years, even before the pandemic hit. The RMB Business Confidence Index was at just 5 points. It ranges from 0 to 100. Just 5 points in the second quarter. That's the lowest level since the survey started in 1975, and it's down 18 points from the first quarter. Africa's most industrialized economy, which entered its second recession in 2 years just last year, has been largely shut down since late March, when the government imposed severe restrictions designed to stem the spread of COVID-19. The country started its phased easing of the lockdown at the start of May. So then Angelo Kubler is live in Johannesburg tonight with the latest data on this survey. Angelo, this obviously does make for pretty grim reading. The index now at the lowest levels, essentially since it first started back in 75. Were there any relative bright spots, however, in the data?
Well, look, the BER, who actually conducts the survey, says that reading of 5 indicates that just about every respondent in quarter two was unhappy with the prevailing business conditions in the country at the time. That's 1,800 executives in the building, manufacturing, retail, wholesale, and the motor trade sectors. They all felt the same. And looking through that report earlier today, the survey compilers say that, in fact, historically, business confidence in this business confidence index actually provides the sectors with some reliable early indications of GDP growth and private fixed income or fixed investment. So there are no bright spots at the moment, although the food production sector, which has operated at full capacity throughout the three lockdown phases that we've had a good, or in fact better performance than in the first quarter, but it couldn't compensate for the other sectors' drops. So not many bright spots at all, Ramah.
Indeed. So the central bank in South Africa, the South African Reserve Bank, still has the country's growth outlook for 2020 at a 7% contraction. But how does it see this recovery playing out in 2021? Should we expect a U-shaped recovery, a V-shaped recovery? What do they have in mind?
Well, it looks like it's going to be a slow recovery, because if we look at the May MPC statement that was read out by the SARB governor, he said that the easing of the lockdown will support growth in the near term. But that's coupled with some high frequency activity indicators that he was talking about, and that will show a pickup, but off a completely and very extremely low base. And he also expects that the economy will return to some pre-pandemic activity levels, but it will take some time. He didn't quantify the time there either. GDP growth expectations, of course, are currently pegged at around 3.8% for 2021, and it drops down to 2.9% in 2022. That all presupposes that the pandemic is brought under control, that the second wave doesn't occur, that's of infections, and that we don't go back into lockdown levels 4 or 5. And of course that the virus projections aren't as dire as some of those models are predicting. So there are lots of moving parts here, and the lack of information or history about how the virus is going to act or behave makes those projections more academic than normal. So it's spotty at best, Ramah.
Indeed, it's quite the time to be trying to make forecasts about economic growth and investment. Angela Copeland there live in Johannesburg. Now, we're still in the country. South Africa, of course, does need foreign investment more than ever before, especially if it's going to fix the damage being done amidst this pandemic. But the question still remains, is the current investment protection regime sufficiently clear and reassuring for foreign capital? And if not, what measures need to be put in place to attract even more investment, particularly in a post-COVID era? Angela Copeland returns once again with that story.
The context to this is that the South African public debt to GDP ratio could reach 80% by 2021, due to the lockdown of the country's economy in April, May, and to a lesser extent in June. But trouble has been brewing since 2010, with investment flows leaving the country.
A decline in confidence in the South African economy in terms of inward investment, and in terms of outward investment, South African corporates, South African Inc., getting nervous about the returns they were receiving in the country and deciding to invest abroad.
There are a couple of concerns for potential investors, including proposed changes to the Constitution about property rights and the bilateral investment treaties that were cancelled several years ago. These need to be looked at.
Look at, renegotiating the bilateral investment treaties which were terminated on a more balanced basis. But just to throw them out the window doesn't send a good message to investors from the EU.
The African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is also an opportunity to give potential investors confidence in investing in South Africa and Africa.
Makes it very interesting for any foreign investor, and if there's a decent investment protection regime for the whole of Africa, which is subject to some form of investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, that makes it hugely interesting for any foreign investor.
There's a perception that some in government are not too keen to protect investors' rights.
There's a huge division in government about what needs to be done, but I actually think, and that's the one positive I take away from all of this, is that there's no alternative. I mean, the pandemic and the impact this is going to have on economic growth, on the fiscus, tax revenues, and the rest of it, the government's going to have no alternative but either to embark on its own on structural economic reform or to be forced into it by a standby facility from the IMF. They can choose.
Not only do investors want returns, but they also want certainty, and they want confirmation that they'll be able to remove their money from the country when they've made their returns. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Sandton, South Africa.
Food security does continue to be a pressing concern around the world, especially given the ongoing pandemic. CGTN's Astatal has warned how United Nations experts are raising the alarm about a potential building crisis.
The UN has issued a dire warning. If countries do not act to shore up the global food supply, nearly 50 million people could fall into extreme poverty.
Clearly, it's important to recognize that food security is essential for our economy. The scale of the scope of the food economy measured as people is 4.5 billion of 7.8 billion on Earth. So nearly 1/3 of whom are exposed to disproportionate risk. So it's a huge part of our population that are at risk.
The current COVID-19 pandemic has affected global food supply chains.
COVID is compounding already a bad situation to begin with. For us, what is really important is to make sure that we are able to reach people who are in worst possible states even before COVID came.
The UN has proposed that countries deem food and nutrition services as essential while scaling up support for food production. It also proposed scaling up support for transport and keeping trade corridors open to ensure that food systems can keep operating. The implementation of protections for those working in the sector was also suggested.
Our food systems are failing, and the COVID-19 pandemic is making things worse. Unless immediate action is taken, it is increasingly clear that there is an impending global food emergency that could have long-term impacts on hundreds of millions of children and adults. Even in countries with abundant food, we see risks of disruptions in the food supply chain. We need to act now to avoid the worst impacts of our efforts to control the pandemic.
Guterres also urged for a more sustainable approach to the global food supply chain. Astatal, CGTN.
On to Nigeria now. It did not fully comply with the pact by oil producers to rein in output and balance demand and supply. It will, however, need to cut an additional 40 to 45,000 barrels a day of output in order to make up for that lapse by the middle of July. The head of the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, or NNPC, Mele Kyari, says that Nigeria had exceeded its quota for production cut under an OPEC Plus agreement by a little less than 100,000 barrels a day in the month of May. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, plus Russia and other non-OPEC producers, agreed back in April to cut supply by 9.7 million barrels a day, both in May and in June, in order to support prices as coronavirus lockdowns caused demand to essentially collapse. The group agreed to sustain those cuts, which are equal to roughly 10% of global output, all the way through to July. On to some corporate headlines now. Let's start in Zambia. Mine Ministry officials over there will start next month personally collecting samples from mine sites around the country. The idea here is to prevent mining companies from looking to undervalue the production in order to pay a lot less in tax. The change essentially also implies that the ministry will no longer accept samples submitted by exporters. This is the latest push by Zambia's government to squeeze even more revenue from the mining sector. Cote d'Ivoire's Coffee and Cocoa Council is introducing a range of reforms that aim to boost domestic exporters. That includes reducing fees they have to pay when they acquire beans. The new measures also limit stockpiling of beans by multinational traders. Domestic exporters say that the practice tends to drive up prices and it prevents them from fulfilling their export contracts. These new reforms are recommended in line with an audit ordered by the Council. Africa's largest pay TV group, MultiChoice, has reported its first full-year profit as a standalone company. Headline earnings per share, that's the main profit measure used in South Africa, was about 8 or so US cents for the year that ended on the 31st of March. Subscriber growth did slow down slightly. It went up by only 5% year on year. And finally, Vodafone is warning that the UK's desire to lead the world in 5G tech will face quite the blow if it decides to remove China's Huawei tech from its telecommunications infrastructure. This development comes as the UK held talks on 5G networking equipment supplies with Japan's NEC Corporation and South Korea's Samsung Electronics as part of a bid to develop alternatives to Huawei. The UK has designated Huawei as a high-risk vendor back in January, capping its 5G involvement to 35% and essentially excluding it from the data-heavy core of the network. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. We'll explore how shrinking ad revenue is decimating the media industry. We'll look at the case study of Nigeria. And the Universal Music Group launches in Africa, promising local artists an international platform.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sumitra Naidoo. Hello, Naro.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Welcome back to the program. 2019 was an interesting year. It was the third consecutive year in which the amount of capital raised by private equity firms aimed squarely at Africa went up. At $3.8 billion, 2019's figure was about 15% short of the amount raised in 2015, but it was 40% higher than the amount of capital raised the year before. Reported volumes, however, have been rising consistently as far as deals are concerned in the 5 years to 2019. But at a time when COVID-19 is bringing economic activity around the world to a halt, how will these key trends, if you will, change? That's a question I put to the Executive Director of the East Africa Private Equity and Venture Capital Association, Eva Warege. She pointed out that the sector's investments in fast-moving consumer goods, for example, haven't been hit quite as hard as some may have thought.
People would anticipate that the deal flow in 2020 may have been adversely affected by the COVID-19 environment. What I realized was for the deals disclosed as at May 2019, we had about 8 deals in 2019, and we have a similar number, 8 deals for the year 2020, which is to show that private equity is not necessarily affected by the immediate environment. So the deals that were closed in 2020, probably discussions started in 2019 and maybe earlier. And that's reflective of how private equity works. We're not seeing as much disruption in closing deals. There may be some instances, especially where, say, regulatory consent may be required on competition or on seeking industry-specific regulation, where the regulators may not be able to dispatch feedback as fast as they would have otherwise.
Right. One of the things that you mentioned a little earlier was where exactly this capital is being deployed: fast-moving consumer goods, education, and healthcare. And at a time when household spending and household incomes are either being eroded or they're pretty static, it would seem that these are also the sort of industries that would be hardest hit by a reduction in expenditure. You know, you walk into a supermarket, instead of buying 1,000 bob worth of soap, for instance, you cut that down to 500 or thereabouts. Are these specific industries perhaps the most affected in this pandemic, or are there other industries that may perhaps be more insulated to this pandemic because we're seeing an increase in expenditure there, like perhaps on the fintech side?
In speaking to private equity firms that have invested in multiple sectors, one of the things that came out for me is, at least where retail and consumer goods is concerned, there's not as much disruption as they would have expected. First of all, you'll acknowledge that the shopping basket traditionally has consisted of essential goods. It's the flour, it's bar soap and cooking oil, the essentials of the household. And in that regard, not much has changed in terms of the shopping basket and what it carries even post-COVID. And then the other thing that came out for me in interacting with private equity funds that had invested in retail and consumer goods is 60% of their supplies is actually 60% of supplies to retail stores and areas where consumers can access these goods is actually production from within the region. So it comes from, if it's Kenya, it's something that's produced in Kenya. If you're looking at wheat flour or looking at maize flour or the bar soap that would constitute this.
So supply chains are essentially insulated from the sort of supply chain shocks that we're seeing elsewhere.
Exactly. So that's one of the things that was a bit refreshing, that there's not as much disruption in some of those core sectors for private equity funds. But having said that, there are other sectors that have obviously experienced some shock. Education comes to mind. Obviously, children are now having to learn at home, and with that comes an adjustment in how you can deliver the services to the students and the weighted cost associated with the service delivery that is virtual learning now. And
there's
on one
also
hand,
an associated problem with willingness to pay in that respect, because we keep seeing these fights between parent associations on one hand and schools on the other, where schools are saying you've got to keep paying fees, but parents are like, for what? For virtual learning?
Yes. So for us as a fund that's tasked with value creation, one of the things that we have to establish is how do we continue to deliver quality service to these students within the given environment, and obviously cognizant of the parents' economic situation.
My conversation there around private equity in East Africa. Let's head over to West Africa now. The traditional media sector in Nigeria is experiencing an enormous revenue drain. This comes as the majority of businesses that they rely on for ad revenue are cutting back on their ad budgets in order to survive the impact of this pandemic. Newspapers and magazines have lost more than 60% of advertising revenue, and that's left traditional media in a very precarious position. CGTN's Kelechi Mikalam filed this report.
Empty offices and depleted revenue rocks this magazine outlet run by Dan Akpova in Abuja, Nigeria's capital. The crippling effect of the coronavirus on all sectors of the economy is felt more by the traditional media like this one. Advertising revenue remains a core stream of earnings for them. But as other businesses are forced to cut back on advert budgets, the outlet has lost more than half of its revenue since the lockdown.
The greatest challenge, like I said earlier, is lack of revenue. The revenues are not coming in like they should. We've lost 60% of the advert revenue that used to come, and that has a telling effect on the business. But I don't know how that's going to come back, because now people have gotten used to working remotely. So the coronavirus had made people look for different ways of doing things. So those advert revenues might not come immediately, because the government offices, and private concerns who advertise with us, since they were forced to shut down because of the coronavirus or COVID-19, no longer advertised with us.
Without any loan intervention, publisher Dan Akpova has managed to keep all his staff on employment and payroll. A steady decrease in earnings continues to threaten the sustainability of businesses like his, and many other outlets have laid off staff and cut back on salaries.
It has affected us, even in terms of news gathering. It has affected us. Offices are not open. Places where you go to source stories are closed because of social distancing. Offices are not open. People are not going to work. And that has also impacted on advertising. We haven't cut any staff. We're tempted to, but we have not reduced any staff because we're resilient. And I know that some media houses cut staff strength, cut staff salary. We haven't done that. But it cannot continue like this. Something has to be done. Because if it continues like this, a lot of these warehouses will go out of business.
Meeting my staff every day is always a booster for me. And letting that go off has made work a bit no longer fun for me. So that is what I think I've had to forgo.
To stay afloat, most print media organizations have reduced sizes and copies of prints to save cost. Many are looking to leverage on technology and install paid online subscription for readers to access the contents. Kelechi Emekalam, CGT and Abuja, Nigeria.
Elsewhere, South Africa is facing quite the uphill battle as the number of COVID-19 cases exceed 50,000, with many hospitals recording a rise in the number of new patients that they have to deal with. A number of local manufacturers have stepped in to make protective gear and medical equipment. Nissan South Africa, for example, has designed a unique box designed to boost protection for healthcare workers while they're treating patients. Here's CGTN's Julie Shire with that report.
Nissan, which manufactures vehicles in South Africa's capital Pretoria, swapped its operations during the COVID-19 pandemic to work with the University of Pretoria to make isolation boxes for patients.
We've managed to repurpose one of our cutting robots in the plant, in the manufacturing plant actually, to cut the polycarbonate sheets. So we do a robotic cutout and then we do a manual assembly by the maintenance team working in our plant. Some of the guys actually volunteered their time privately to work on this project.
The boxes easily fit over a patient's head during risky procedures. More than 500 medical staff have been infected with COVID-19. A number of medics have died of the illness.
The frontline healthcare workers are obviously at high risk because they're in direct contact with people that might be able to transmit the virus. Therefore, it is important for them not only to use the necessary protective clothing, the PPE as we all know, but this will help in addition to protect them when they're in direct contact with infected patients.
So we usually reserve these for the patients where we're going to do procedures that generate aerosols. So when we need to intubate a patient, to put them on a ventilator, we secure their airway, that would be the one procedure. Suctioning would be another procedure when we collect endotracheal aspirates, and also when we extubate, in other words, when we take the endotracheal tube out when a patient comes off a ventilator.
Over a dozen boxes have been handed over to the Steve Biko Academic Hospital. They can easily be churned out if health facilities are overstretched.
I think COVID-19 is creating this entire industry to actually protect people against COVID-19 as a specific pandemic. So we are enriched by the experience of manufacturing of these boxes, and we will continue to work with specific special partners in order to generate more support for South Africa.
South Africa's manufacturers have come to the rescue in a time of great need. The outbreak is expected to worsen with cold weather setting in and more people on the move again. Julie Shire, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Let's talk about a little company you might have heard of, Def Jam Records. They're setting up shop on the African continent. The firm started back in 1984. The American hip-hop recording label signed on the likes of some pretty iconic artists, LL Cool J, DMX, Ja Rule, basically the sounds of my youth. The label that was inspired by downtown New York hip-hop culture over 35 years ago is now giving African artists a route to the international market. Here's CGTN Sumitra Naidu with that story.
Def Jam attracted some of the most popular voices around. Three decades later, the iconic label is still managing some of the most famous names in the business. Def Jam now has an African branch dedicated to local talent. Def Jam Africa has set up in Nigeria and in South Africa and has already signed up a few artists.
I was actually taken aback because I wasn't expecting that, and I didn't know I was worthy of such an incredible opportunity, specifically because I'm still so new to the game. I feel like it's going to give me an opportunity to broaden the ears that get to hear my music, whether it's throughout Africa or Europe or the US.
Def Jam was bought up by the Universal Music Group back in 1999. As the name suggests, UMG Records is the largest music group in the world. According to JP Morgan, the group was worth near $50 million in 2019.
It's a great opportunity for South African artists right now. It gives them a label to aspire to be signed to if you're specializing in hip-hop. It gives them the comfort of knowing that the resources that will be allocated to Def Jam Africa are those that are relevant to their genre. And a team that understands the A&R and the marketing of hip-hop and the culture and the best way to help develop it and grow it beyond its immediate borders.
Tulo is one of 9 artists that have already been signed under Def Jam Africa. Tulo made her rapping debut on the Migos Culture Tour in South Africa in 2017 and has since released 3 singles.
This is being seen as a real clinch for African artists. They will be well supported. They will also have the benefit of being automatically linked to international markets through the Universal Music Group.
They also have the option of working with a major label to try and develop their artist and their talent to also be able to reach new markets outside of South Africa, outside of Nigeria, and outside of the continent.
The new label will have offices in Lagos and in Johannesburg for now, but the label will recruit artists from across the continent. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
It's 18:30 GMT. You're watching Global Business Africa. Here's what's coming up next. The global economy is forecast to drop by 6% in output this year, according to the OECD. And the US president prohibits some Chinese graduate students from obtaining visas effective from the 1st of June.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back to the program. These are the stories making your headlines at this hour. An attack by the group Boko Haram has killed at least 69 people in northern Nigeria. Gunmen attacked the village of Faduma Koloram, located in the country's Borno state. Witnesses say that the gunmen razed the village to the ground. They also allegedly stole over 1,000 head of cattle and camels. Elsewhere, at least 20 African migrants have lost their lives after the dinghy they were in capsized off the Tunisian coastline. The boat was reportedly carrying more than 50 people at the time. The migrants had set out over the weekend aiming to get to the Italian coast. Coast Guard units in the army are still searching for those who are still missing. Over in Ethiopia, the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's term has been extended by a year. Ethiopia's parliament approved this on Wednesday. This comes after the Prime Minister postponed elections that had initially been planned for the month of August. The extension comes as the country continues to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, the African Union has sent its condolences to the citizens of Burundi following the death of their outgoing president, Pierre Nkurunziza. The former head of state, passed away on Tuesday at the age of 55. That's a run through your headlines. Hundreds of millions of people have lost their jobs due to the coronavirus pandemic. This crisis, of course, has hit the poor and the young the hardest, and it's worsening inequalities pretty much around the world. This is according to an analysis by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The organization's Secretary General, Angel Gurria, says that in the best case scenario, if there's no second wave of infections, there will be a global drop in economic output of at least 6% this year and a rise of 2.8% in 2021.
We're in the midst of a combined global, very global, perhaps the most global health, economic, and social crisis. And it's simply the most severe any of us have ever witnessed. 400,000 deaths already, 7 million recorded cases so far, both numbers likely being significantly underestimated. Now, on the economic front, the 6% decline in global GDP that we foresee in 2020 is larger by far than any we have projected in the 60 years since the OECD was created.
The global aviation industry, needless to say, is having its worst year on record so far. The International Air Transport Association predicted that airlines, in fact, are set to lose $84 billion in revenue this year. Carriers are now counting the cost of lost business as the debt pile swollen by bailouts and a diminished outlook for demand, not just this year, but the next as well. The Director General of IATA said that every day this year will add about $230 million to industry losses. He's also urging governments to take measures to help airlines get back into the sky.
The point now is we should restart quickly. We are ready. The processes are ready. The airlines are ready. We are expecting governments now to be, fast and pushy to reopen borders. Of course, with all the necessary health controls, sanitary check, precautions, we have no problem with that. Huh? But things are ready. Methodology are ready. Equipments are ready. Airlines are ready. People are trained. We should fly again.
China's aviation regulator said on Wednesday that China's air passenger traffic halved in the month of May to 26 million as the pandemic hampered travel over there. That compared to the 69% year-on-year drop in the month of April. Clearly, you can see there's a slowing pace in that decline. Here's GTN's Lu Sirui with the details.
The seventh freedom allows foreign carriers to operate flights between two countries without the need to touch down in the airline's home country. For instance, a Japanese airline will be able to operate flights from Hainan to Thailand. This will allow Hainan province to be the first in the country to enjoy such degree of opening up in the civil aviation industry. The policy will apply to both passenger and cargo flights.
With this policy, Hainan's degree of openness will be increased. It will also help to attract more people and capital to facilitate Hainan's economic reforms and industrial restructuring.
In 2018, China wrote out a plan for building its southern island province of Hainan into a pilot free trade zone. The plan aims to facilitate free trade, increase investment, and facilitate cross-border capital flows in Hainan. Under the plan, designated imported goods will be exempt from tariffs on the whole island. Officials say the government will encourage more flights that connect Hainan and other cities. Lu Sirui, CGTN, Beijing.
A London-based consultancy Brand Finance is estimating that the global hotel sector could lose up to 20% of cumulative brand value because of this pandemic. In dollar terms, it translates to roughly $14 billion potentially being wiped out. Now, the report says that properties with strong brands, where social distancing protocols are easier to implement, will be less affected. It does estimate, however, that most of the top hotel brands might actually see the values rise, net value gain, while smaller brands will lose out. The majority of these most valuable hotel brands are still those based in the United States. Hilton is still the world's most valuable hotel brand in this ranking. Italy started easing measures against COVID-19 nearly a month ago after a pretty strict 2-month lockdown. Restaurants and shops reopened in the middle of May and life has gotten back to some semblance of normalcy. But by then, many businesses had already taken some pretty severe losses. Michal Bardavid brings us up to speed with the latest.
Luciana Spina owns a small children's clothes shop in central Rome. Launching her own business was a dream of hers after years of working as a street vendor. Luciana says she had high hopes for the month of May, when demand is usually high for babies' ceremonial clothing. An opportunity now missed.
E quindi su questo proposito che ti mette paura, che era la tua risorsa.
It was my resource. I had invested the last crumbs. I see myself lost, and for the first time in my life, I feel a sense of anger. The virus completely blew me away. I wonder what I will do. What will it be like tomorrow?
Her dream is now fading. Luciana is holding a final clearance sale before closing down her shop for good. Another industry hit hard by COVID-19 has been the restaurant business. Bars and cafes, usually packed out, struggled under lockdown with no income. The owner of Bounty Restaurant in Rimini says he felt suffocated during that period.
Each day that passes is like keeping your head underwater a minute longer. So every day that passes, there is a company that dies and will no longer be able to reopen.
His restaurant was able to reopen at the end of May, but not at full capacity due to social distancing regulations. Giuliano is hopeful he will make a recovery, but has doubts.
Opening is not synonymous with starting again with a profit. It can sometimes be synonymous with losing even more.
In May, Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte announced Italy was taking a calculated risk in order to restart the country's economy, in the hope of saving businesses. But for many, like Luciana's, it is a move that has come too late. Michal Bardavid, CGTN.
For many years now, the United States has been the top destination for Chinese nationals looking for advanced degrees. But there's a bit of trouble on the horizon. Heightened political tensions have prompted President Donald Trump to prohibit some Chinese grad students from getting visas effective from the 1st of June. But even before that, a recent survey did find that Chinese families were reconsidering sending their kids across the Pacific to the United States. And that may have some pretty big repercussions for America's higher education sector. CGTN's Karina Huber explores what those may be.
New York University in Manhattan has more international students than any other college in the United States. 28% of its first-year students in 2018 were from abroad, with average annual tuition alone topping $50,000 a year. Those students are a big source of revenue.
Almost every single one of them pays full tuition. Some of them pay premium tuition. And so international students have become a big business in U.S. colleges and universities.
Despite rising tensions between China and the U.S., there were more than 369,000 Chinese students enrolled in U.S. higher education programs, more than from any other country. And their tuition payments add up to some $15 billion annually.
U.S. higher education is still the top choice for many Chinese students for the many great qualities and ideals that it embodies and represents.
But Xiaofeng Wan from Amherst College in Massachusetts worries that may change.
In October, he conducted a survey of high school college counselors in China. 87% of those surveyed said Chinese families are reconsidering sending their children to study in the United States, and that was before the pandemic.
It was also before the Trump administration announced new visa restrictions on Chinese graduate students suspected of having military ties. But Wan says already tougher visa policies were cited as a concern by Chinese families, as was cost, with China's weakened currency making a U.S. college education more expensive. Gun violence and a general unease amid frayed political ties were cited too. Now the pandemic adds another layer of concern.
The anti-Asian sentiment that has emerged from the pandemic and the countless racially motivated incidents and attacks have only fueled sort of their worries of sending their precious children here, many of whom are the only child in their families.
Then there's the logistical challenge. Consular visa services have been suspended amid the pandemic, and travel to the U.S. is exceedingly difficult at the moment. Admissions advisor Barry Norman says what this means for U.S. colleges depends on the school. Those, like NYU, with deep pockets and long wait lists, will likely be fine financially. But she says there will be other losses.
When the attraction is gone for those students to come to the U.S., there's just an experiential and cultural and intellectual difference and loss that happens.
Karina Huber, CGTN, New York.
All right, then a quick run through commodities here for you. So Brent has had an interesting run of gains in the last 4 weeks, and that has been pretty solid. It's actually risen by over 35% to around $41 a barrel. The discount to Brent on one of Nigeria's prime grades, Bonny Light, has actually swung around from a discount of nearly $4 a barrel to just over $1 a barrel at the moment. Copper also continuing a strong run of gains in the quarter. It hit a 4-month high today in London, just over $5,906 per ton. Here's what's coming up next.
Problem, especially women who feel like there's no way they can be seen with kinky hair.
We'll explore the politics and the business of natural hair care with a co-founder of Marini Naturals.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to the program. Now, the global hair care market was estimated to be worth at least $90 billion just last year, but it tends to overlook one specific market segment, that of natural African hair. For decades, the bulk of the cosmetics industry has not really bothered to cater for this unique market segment, but that has in turn created a market opening that African entrepreneurs are taking full advantage of. One such company is Marini Naturals. It's a 5-year-old Kenyan natural hair care brand. I spoke to the firm's CEO and co-founder, Michelle Ntalami, a little earlier, as she explained that the firm's digital roots are making it pretty resilient amidst this pandemic.
When you just look at the statistics of where all my customers come from, 80% of them are from social media. And out of that pie chart, the 80%, 60% of those are from Instagram, another 10 or 15% from YouTube, and another from Google and online. So you can really see the impact of online marketing, digital marketing to sales.
Moving forward, though, after all of this, 2019 is a fantastic year. 2020 comes along, and then you have this massive pandemic that hits completely out of nowhere. How's your business been affected?
Good and bad. It's been positive and negative, but I tend to say more of positive because, so for starters, we used to have a store at the junction in Nakumatt Junction, which is one of the biggest shopping malls in Nairobi, in Kenya. And we were not able to sustain that because once the pandemic hit, customers obviously were not leaving their homes. So obviously they were not coming to our store to buy. At the same time, your landlord is still demanding that same rent. He is not slashing the prices. He does not want to know that there's a pandemic. So we really needed to act fast. So my partner and I decided to make an executive decision to close down that store. It has, of course, impacted our business negatively in that customers, should we reopen, are no longer able to come to our physical store. And of course, just the brand visibility that it gave Marini Naturals is no longer there. However, I think the fact that we've also seen an increase in online sales once we closed the Junction store because customers still need their Marini product. So they will still go online and buy Marini Naturals. And I think for the first time, we hit our all-time high in terms of website sales from Marini Naturals.
What about the logistics side of things? Because a lot of these, the product is essentially put together here in Kenya. Yeah. But when this pandemic hit and logistic chains were being disrupted up and down the coast, were you affected? Were you able to get your products inside, or is the fact that most of your inputs are essentially locally sourced, that sort of insulated your production chain?
Man, Ramah, that's one of the things that has negatively impacted our business. It's been extremely tough. Our packaging is not sourced from Kenya, let alone Africa. It's not sourced from around. We source our packaging from Asia. And we currently have a container stuck at the port because of the pandemic. And it's been stuck there for now 3 months, literally. And nothing is moving out, nothing is moving in. So we are in that's one of the ways in which Corona has impacted the business negatively.
I'm sure there have been offers to put capital into the business to buy a stake in it, but is that something that you're considering?
Definitely, there have been offers almost as soon as we launched. We launched in 2015. I think from 2016 to date, there have been offers, and it's definitely something that I am open to. However, I do feel that there's a level that I am trying to get the company to which my partner and I managed to hit that milestone late last year in 2019.
And what sort of capital would you be looking for at this point in time? Or more accurately, what kind of investor are you looking for? Because usually the conversation when it comes to private equity and venture capital is there has to be that match, a meeting of minds between the business on one hand and whoever's bringing the capital. So what would your ideal investor be?
2020 is actually our year for expansion and just scaling, growth. We want Marini to be in Barbados, we want Marini to be in Walmart, in Target, in Boots, in Tesco. So we'd be looking at an investment of about $1 to $2 million. And we are open to debt financing, we're open to debt and equity, convertible notes. And these are conversations that we're actually currently having with a couple of investors. But more than that, what we see is really, the sweet spot for Marini is not just to get capital, but also to get an investor who can be able to help us with our expansion strategies. So it shouldn't just be about money for us. It's also about really aligning with our vision of making Marini Naturals become the leading natural hair care line founded by an African woman in Africa and manufactured in Africa. And I think it's possible.
Now, desperate times do call for quite a bit of adaptation. In South Africa's hair care sector, hairdressers are now offering door-to-door services despite the nationwide lockdown and the risk of spreading COVID-19. It's either that or you go hungry. CGTN's Terry Wangare has that story on Grassroots tonight.
Hairdresser Beauty Matunhira arrives at her client's home in Johannesburg armed with dye, relaxer, ready to tackle her next case of lockdown hair.
There are few who are allowing us to come and do their hair at home. Some they're afraid. Because when getting inside their complex, sometimes we have to sneak, sometimes we have to bribe the securities, sometimes we have to hide inside their cars, clients' cars, so that we'll enter the complex.
Discreet house calls have become routine for Beauty, who found herself out of a job when salons and barbershops were forced to close under South Africa's coronavirus lockdown, which is now in its 11th week.
It's better because we're managing to buy food. Since the money is not enough for paying rent and do everything, sending our parents' money home, but at least we are managing to buy food.
Unable to send money to her parents back home in Zimbabwe, she's also worried about the future. Beauty is risking jail time by visiting clients at home, as hairdressers are still banned from working under the lockdown rules, even as the government has begun to relax restrictions to allow for a partial reopening of the economy.
We actually do sneak in a stylist or anybody I need to fix myself for me. I sneak them in too, but it has been hard because of this COVID-19. It has been hard, really hard.
For barbershops, the situation is also dire.
No work, no income. I'm the breadwinner of my family and seen it to another 2-3 months. And the government don't want us to work. And if we open our shops, it's against the law. It becomes criminalized.
An industry survey in April showed that around 70% of businesses were contemplating closures and job cuts, and up to 21% were already closed.
We have conducted a survey, and people who indicated that they will be able to sustain the lockdown and for a period thereafter to run their businesses successfully once again, that was about 52% as well. And that 52% significantly dropped to 18%. Already, businesses closing forever, 20 to 21%.
Last week, the government told the Employers' Organization for Hairdressing, Cosmetology and Beauty that it was drafting guidelines for the reopening of the personal care sector, but did not provide a time frame. It is hoped that these guidelines are released sooner rather than later for the sake of Beauty and Adele. Terry Wangare, CGTN.
Now, Egypt's film industry is the largest in the Arab world, but under the current pandemic, it's been suffering because movie theaters obviously have been shut down and people really aren't going to see any movies at this point in time. While filmmakers are still talking to government to open theatres under specific conditions, they're also looking for other ways to get their content to you. Here's CGTN's Adel El-Marouki with the details.
The coronavirus pandemic has completely shut all movie theatres in Egypt, which has for decades been the main source of revenues for movie productions. Egypt has 3 main cinema seasons annually. COVID-19 has deprived the industry from 2 of them.
When theaters were closed, we lost our Eid and summer seasons. This has created a big problem. Producers couldn't release new films and cinema owners couldn't open their gates. We now have shelved movies and several films in post-production were not finished.
But while this crisis has made the industry bleed millions of dollars, some filmmakers have been seeking to market their movies in new ways. Digital platforms have been the salvation to some producers.
Filmmakers are not seeing actual losses. They have unreleased productions, which are assets that will still generate revenues once premiered. That has become an opportunity for digital platforms, which are now buying movies or even producing. So we are seeing movie premieres now are on these internet-based services rather than on theaters. Digital is booming, and now there are more people watching online.
To decrease losses, we are seeing filmmakers producing low-budget movies to sell it on online platforms. But the blockbusters cannot follow that lead until cinemas are open.
Representatives of the cinema industry are negotiating terms of reopening theaters with the government. While the guidelines for their operation are not final yet, they will definitely include a cap to theaters' capacity. That will lead to a significant drop in revenues from cinemas.
Digital platforms in Egypt are still developing, so their financial gains are quite limited, especially to blockbusters which have high production cost. It's why many producers want to wait until cinemas are partially open, so at least they can combine their revenues from both traditional and digital screening opportunities. Adel El-Marouki, CGTN, Cairo.
All right, then, a run through the currencies as we wrap up the program. Not much of a change as far as the Kenyan shilling is concerned. Why are you focusing on that? Because Kenya and Uganda are laying out their spending plans for the 2020-2021 fiscal year tomorrow. We know what the broad outlines for the spending side looks like. In Kenya's case, at least $25 billion in planned expenditure, fiscal deficit close to 8%. What is not clear at this point are the changes to the tax code that are needed to fund that budget. Those are coming out tomorrow. We'll have the latest analysis from Nikhil Hero of Bowman's Law as part of our regional wrap for you right on the program at 1800 GMT. See you then. For now, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen on the program in the last hour. There are many ways to get your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The news continues on CGTN.